26 Stop Buying Shampoo. This $4 Amish recipe grew back my hair. In 60 days, the mirror doesn't lie in morning light. You notice things there you ignore all day. A plastic bottle slides slightly on the sink, half empty, again. The label is faded where wet hands kept grabbing it. You squeeze the last bit out and wonder how it always runs out faster than you remember buying. There's a thinness at the crown you didn't used to notice. Not panic, just awareness, quiet and steady. 60 days ago, I changed one small thing in this room. $4, kitchen ingredients, nothing fancy, nothing labeled professional. And something odd started happening by the second week. Something I didn't expect at all. Most people would dismiss it immediately. I almost did too. But the strange part is this: once you see it, you can't unsee it. There are a few of us still paying attention to the small things like this. Not trends, not products, just what actually holds up in a real kitchen, in real hands, over time. If you've ever tried something your grandparents swore by and it worked better than it should have, tell me about it. I read those stories closely, and if you want to keep following these quiet old ways of doing things, stay close. There's more coming from the same kind of place. The bathroom is still. Steam clings to the mirror like breath held too long. Your hand reaches for the same bottle it always reaches for. The plastic is soft in places it shouldn't be soft. It tips slightly when you set it down, like it's tired too. There's a moment most people don't talk about. When something familiar stops feeling harmless. It's not dramatic, no alarm, no sudden decision, just a quiet noticing that keeps returning. You start seeing your own habits differently, in small flashes. The way you rinse longer than you used to. The way more bottle seems to disappear for the same result, and somewhere in that repetition, a question forms. Not loud, just persistent. What exactly am I washing off, and what am I washing in? The first time I asked it, I ignored it immediately. Because that's what most people do with small, uncomfortable thoughts. But they don't stay gone. They come back in the mirror, in the shower, in the sink light that never quite hits the same way twice. I notice my hair more in those moments, not in panic, just observation. The way a man notices a fence leaning slightly more than last season. No one tells you how much of this becomes routine maintenance. Not just cleaning, but repeating. And repetition starts to feel like dependency when you pay attention. Somewhere along the way, washing your hair stopped being simple. It turned into a system. Bottles, steps, cycles. A quiet expectation that more is always needed. I remember my grandfather's sink, not polished, not modern. Just a basin, worn edges, steady hands. He didn't have a shelf full of bottles. Just a bar of soap that sat like it belonged there. His hair always looked the same. Not styled, just present. Like it wasn't being argued with every morning. That memory doesn't tell you what to do. It just sits there, unchanged. And that's what makes it uncomfortable, because modern habits don't like being compared to simple ones. One evening I stood in this bathroom longer than usual. The bottle in my hand felt lighter than it should have, not physically, somehow, meaningfully. I started thinking about cost in a different way, not just dollars, but repeat cost, weekly cost, yearly cost, lifetime cost. How many bottles for one head of hair over decades? No one really asks that. Because the answer makes the system look too normal to question. That night, I didn't throw anything away. That would have been too clean a break. Instead, I did something quieter. I stopped replacing it immediately, just for a week. That was all. A small pause, nothing more. And that's when the first strange thing happened. Not right away, not even day one. It started subtle, almost dismissible, and it made me realize something I wasn't prepared to admit yet. Because if that week meant anything, then a lot of other things might also be negotiable. That's where the thought first came in, not fully formed, not confident. Just a rumor I heard once from a man who fixed everything he owned instead of replacing it. He mentioned something simple, almost offhand, a plain Amish-style kitchen wash, $4 worth of ingredients, made from things already sitting in most homes. I didn't believe him, but I didn't forget it either, and that's where this really begins to shift. The moment that phrase stuck in my head, it didn't feel important, just something you file away behind other thoughts and forget. But that's not how simple ideas work. They don't leave. They settle. I kept thinking about that man's words. $4, kitchen ingredients, something old style, not because I believed it, because I didn't. And that's usually where curiosity begins, not in agreement, in doubt that refuses to stay quiet. The longer I went without replacing that bottle, the more I noticed something else. The routine didn't feel broken, but it didn't feel neutral anymore either. It started to feel like maintenance for its own sake. That's the quiet trick most systems rely on. They don't need you to feel trapped, just slightly unthinking. You don't question something that works well enough. That's the most stable place anything can live. Hair care especially sits in that space. You're never told it should resolve, only managed. Wash, repeat, condition, repeat again. A loop that feels like hygiene, but behaves like habit. And once you step back even a little, you start noticing the structure of it, not the products themselves, the repetition underneath them. There's a simple explanation most people never hear in plain language. When you strip natural oils from the scalp too often, the body responds. It doesn't stop producing, it adjusts. Sometimes that means more oil, sometimes irritation, sometimes just imbalance. Nothing dramatic, just constant correction. And correction becomes the new normal. That's where the cycle quietly holds people, not through harm, through adjustment. I'm not saying modern shampoo is some kind of enemy. That would be too simple, and life rarely is. But I started understanding why some folks step away from it entirely. Not out of rebellion, out of tiredness. There was a man down the road from where I used to work, older, quiet, always had grease under his nails from fixing what others threw away. He didn't talk much about health or habits, but one day I noticed something different. He looked the same, but not quite. Less irritation around the scalp, less of that constant scratching people don't notice they do. I asked him once, casually, what he was using. He didn't give a brand name. He just said he stopped buying bottles a long time ago and started using something he made in his own kitchen. He didn't push it, didn't explain it like a lesson, just said it like someone describing weather. I remember thinking it couldn't be that simple, because most things aren't. But he added one line I didn't forget. He said, most things you keep buying are things you never needed to keep buying. I didn't agree with him at the time, but I didn't forget that either, because ideas like that sit in the background of your mind, quietly waiting for evidence, and sometimes life gives you small openings to test them. That's what my week without replacing the bottle became. Not a decision, just a pause. At first nothing changed, which almost made it easier to dismiss entirely. But around the middle of that stretch, something subtle shifted. Not dramatic, not obvious. Just different enough to notice if you were paying attention. Less tightness after washing. Less of that immediate need to fix it again feeling. And that's where things get complicated. Because when something small changes without permission, you start paying closer attention. That's also where doubt starts pulling in two directions. One side says it's coincidence. The other says maybe you've been overcomplicating something simple for years. That's when I finally decided to look deeper into what that man meant. Not by searching for products, but by understanding what he was actually doing in his kitchen. And that's where the Amish-style wash enters this story properly. Not as a miracle, not as a cure, just as a method built from a completely different assumption that maybe simple cleaning doesn't need to become a system at all. The recipe itself, when I first heard it described, almost sounded too plain to matter, which is usually how the oldest ideas arrive. And I didn't expect it to change anything, but I also didn't expect that week to feel different either. So I wrote it down, every part of it. And the first time I made it, I realized something I wasn't ready for, because it didn't behave like shampoo at all. It behaved like something older, something that doesn't try to correct you every time you use it. And that's where the real shift begins. I didn't go looking for a revolution in a jar. That's not how these things usually start. It started with a quiet afternoon, a cleared kitchen table, and a small set of things most homes already have somewhere in a cabinet. Nothing labeled special, nothing labeled solution, just plain items. The kind you don't think twice about. A glass jar, warm water, a mild soap base, and something simple to balance the scalp afterward, the way old households sometimes did without naming it anything fancy. No ceremony, no performance, just mixing. The kind of mixing you do while thinking about something else entirely. I remember the sound more than anything at first, the slow stir against glass. That soft dragging sound that feels older than packaging ever did. There's something grounding about simple preparation. No instructions flashing at you, no warning labels, just cause and effect in real time. And in that moment, something shifts in how you think about care. Not improvement, care. The cost of the whole thing was almost laughably small. A few dollars spread across multiple weeks of use, not because it was cheap, but because nothing in it was built to be replaced constantly. That's the part that hits you later, not what it does, but what it doesn't require. The first use is always the strange one. Your hands expect foam, expect signal, expect proof, but what you get instead feels quieter, less engineered, and your mind, trained by years of commercial rhythm, interprets different as wrong at first. That's important to say plainly, because not everything simple feels good immediately. In fact, some of the oldest methods take a short adjustment period, not because they're strong, because your routine has been conditioned to constant reinforcement. I noticed that in the first week, there was a moment in the shower where I almost stopped entirely, not because something was wrong, but because nothing was shouting back at me that it was working. That silence can feel uncomfortable. We're used to feedback, immediate reassurance, but this didn't offer that. It just washed and left. That's all. Around that time, I wrote down a few notes for myself, not as advice, just observation, and over time, people asked to see them. So I kept them together in one place, like a simple record of what I was testing in my own home. Nothing fancy, no system, just notes from the kitchen table. If there's one thing I've learned from years of watching what actually lasts in homes like ours, it's this. If something only works when it's complicated, it usually doesn't last long. The second week is where most people would quit, because this is where your expectations start arguing with your experience. You expect instant improvement. You expect confirmation. But instead, you get adjustment. And adjustment feels like uncertainty if you don't recognize it for what it is. There's a moment I remember clearly, standing at the mirror, water still into my hair, noticing something small that didn't match what I expected, less of that tight, stripped feeling. Not dramatic, not obvious, just different. And that's the dangerous part of simple methods. They don't announce themselves, they don't demand belief. They just quietly change the pattern you were used to. Now, I need to be honest about something here. This doesn't work the same for everyone. Some people will try something like this and feel nothing changes at all. Others will find their scalp needs time to adjust more than expected. And a few will decide it simply isn't for them. That's not failure, that's biology. Different heads, different histories, different water, different habits. That's the part most miracle stories skip. But in my experience, the people who stay with it long enough to understand it are usually not chasing miracles at all. They're just tired of unnecessary complexity. And somewhere in that second week, I've stopped thinking about it as trying something. It started becoming routine. Not a project, just a wash. Simple, quiet, repeatable. And that's when something else started to surface, not loudly, not all at once, but enough that I had to pay attention. Because what happens after simplicity settles in is where the real story begins to show itself. There's a strange moment that comes after change. Not the beginning, not the experiment. The moment when it stops feeling like an experiment at all. You don't mark it on a calendar. You just realize one morning you stopped thinking about it. That's what happened here. The jar wasn't new anymore. It just sat there like it belonged. And the shelf in the bathroom stopped feeling like a marketplace. Fewer decisions, fewer labels, fewer small pressures pretending to be normal life. Around the 30-day mark, something subtle settled in. Not dramatic enough to announce itself, but steady enough that you notice it only when you look back. The scalp didn't feel as reactive. That constant sense of needing to fix something eased, not gone, just quieter. And hair itself, well, this is where I need to stay honest. This isn't the kind of thing that flips overnight. And it's not the kind of thing you should trust anyone promising in a straight line. But what I noticed, and what others in similar routines often describe, is less shedding in the brush, a different texture when it dries. A sense that it's not being stripped and rebuilt every single day. Small things. But small things stack over time. That's something the old-timers understood better than we do now. Not because they had better science, but because they had fewer distractions competing for attention. There's a kind of clarity that comes from simplicity, not perfection. Just fewer layers between cause and effect. I think about my grandfather sometimes in this part of the story. Not as a lesson, just as a memory that keeps resurfacing. His hands were always doing something useful. Fixing, cleaning, building, resting only when the day asked for it. He didn't talk much about moths. He just did what worked until it didn't. And when it stopped working, he adjusted, quietly, without ceremony. That kind of thinking doesn't get advertised anymore, because it doesn't sell upgrades, it just lasts. By the time 60 days passed, I wasn't counting anymore. That's the real shift. When something stops being a thing you're trying and becomes how you live. The bathroom shelf stayed simpler. The routine stayed lighter. And the sense of constant replacement started fading into the background, not because everything became perfect, but because everything became enough. And that's the part nobody really talks about. Not improvement, reduction, less noise, less dependency, less friction around something as ordinary as washing your hair. Now, I need to say this clearly because it matters. This isn't magic. It's not going to reverse time. It's not going to solve every scalp or hair issue for every person. Some people will try something like this and decide it doesn't suit them at all, and that's fine. What it can do, for some, is simplify a routine that's been overcomplicated without question for years. That alone changes how a home feels. Less purchasing, less replacing, less wondering what you're missing, just steady use of simple things. There's a kind of quiet freedom in that, not loud freedom, not rebellious freedom, the kind you only notice when you realize you haven't thought about it in a while. That's when I understood what that man meant. Not that everything modern is wrong, not that everything old is right, but that some parts of life don't need to be rebuilt constantly to be useful. Some just need remembering. If there's one thing I'd leave with you, it's this. Pay attention to the routines you repeat without thinking, not to fear them, just to understand them. Because most people don't choose their systems, they inherit them quietly, and they only notice them when they step outside for a moment. If you've got something in your own home that quietly replaced something more complicated over time, I'd be interested to hear what it was. Not as advice, just as experience. And if there's one more thing worth exploring after this, it might be how many other everyday things were once made at home before they became something you had to keep buying. But that's a different room in the house entirely, and it's still full of stories worth opening.